who used to come into Jamestown Fort doing cartwheels and acrobatics with the English boys. Smith was 27 when he arrived in Virginia in 1607. The romance he claimed to have had with her was invented 17 years later, in a letter he wrote to Queen Consort Anne of Great Britain in 1624, very conveniently after Amonute was already dead and couldn't contradict anything. Before that, Smith never mentioned any romance. Not in his journals, not in his maps, not in his letters to the Virginia Company. The whole, "you're going to kill me but she threw herself in front of me" story is also exclusively his, without a single corroborating witness. A child cannot dispute an adult man, especially when that adult man outlives her and controls the narrative. This isn't historical romanticism, it's colonialism working exactly as it was designed to work. The kidnapping that became a romantic scene. In 1613, Amonute was 17 years old when Captain Samuel Argall kidnapped her. This is not a metaphor. This is not a modern anachronistic interpretation. Argall lured her onto his ship using a man from the Potawatomi tribe as bait, then held her hostage to force her father, Chief Wahunsenacah, to negotiate with the English settlers. Wahunsenacah paid part of the demanded ransom. But the English figured they could ask for more, so they kept her in captivity for over a year while conversions to Protestantism were carried out. She was given the Christian name Rebecca, and a settler named John Rolfe asked Governor Sir Thomas Dale for permission to marry her. Rolfe was 30, she was 17 and a prisoner. The marriage happened in 1614. Historians debate to this day whether she consented or simply had no choice. Hollywood turned the captivity into a romance. The colonial documents are more honest. They call Argall the captor and describe Amonute as a hostage, words Disney preferred to leave out of the script. London, the exhibition, and the death. In 1616, John Rolfe took Amonute to England as a living demonstration that the colonization of Virginia was civilizing the natives. She was presented at the court of King James I, painted in formal portraits wearing European clothes, displayed at London aristocracy parties, as proof that the English could convert and domesticate the American savages. An attraction. She stayed in England for about 10 months. When the ship that was supposed to take her back to Virginia was still in the Thames estuary at Gravesend, she fell gravely ill. She died in March of 1617 at 21 years old. The exact cause was never confirmed. Hypotheses include tuberculosis, pneumonia, or poisoning, the last raised by some historians without definitive conclusion. She was buried at St. George's Church in Gravesend. Her son, Thomas Rolfe, was 2 years old and remained in England. Wahunsenacah never saw his daughter again. The Virginia Company used her marriage and propaganda materials to attract investors and settlers, turning the kidnapping of a girl into a marketing campaign. 17th century corporate creativity. Wahunsenacah, the chief that books reduced to the princess's father. Wahunsenacah, whom the English called Powhatan because they couldn't pronounce his actual name, controlled a confederation of roughly 30 tribes and more than 14,000 people when the English arrived in 1607. This was not a village. It was a functioning state with a taxation system, military structure, diplomatic networks, and trade routes covering much of what is now Virginia. His initial strategy with the English was calculated coexistence. They were few, malnourished, incapable of surviving a winter without help. Wahunsenacah provided food, taught farming techniques, opened trade lines. The English returned the favor by kidnapping his daughter. After Amonute died, he attempted one final war to drive out the settlers in 1618. He died without seeing the outcome. The Powhatan Confederacy sustained resistance until 1646, when the Treaty of 1646 officially reduced their territories to designated reservations. The man who built a 14,000-person state entered history as the Disney princess's father, the War of Opechancanough, brother of Wahunsenacah. Opechancanough waited. He watched the English arrive with 740 settlers in 1607. He watched that number grow to more than 4,000 in 15 years. He watched treaties being made and broken. He watched territories being taken with documents that nobody in the Confederacy had fully understood or agreed to. On March 22, 1622, he coordinated a simultaneous attack on more than 30 English settlements along the James River. In one day, 347 colonists were killed, roughly 1/3 of Virginia's colonial population. The plan was not to exterminate the English. It was to demonstrate that the Powhatan Confederacy still controlled the territory and that the settlers existed by tolerance, not by right. The Virginia Company responded with a scorched earth policy. In 1644, over 100 years old and nearly blind, Opechancanough attempted a second coordinated offensive. He was captured, brought to Jamestown as a living trophy, and murdered by a guard while chained. The governor had promised he would be kept alive. Another colonial promise honored: the invention of the name Pocahontas. Pocahontas was not her name. It was an informal nickname, likely of Algonquian origin, roughly translating to naughty girl or playful child. Her real name was Amonute. She also had a secret spiritual name, Matawaka, used by family and close people, which the English only discovered later. When she was taken to England, the English called her Lady Rebecca. That was Cheese, the name she received during her forced baptism in captivity. The name Pocahontas that Disney immortalized was literally a childhood nickname, the equivalent of entering world history under the nickname your family called you when you were 6 years old. After she died, the name Pocahontas was progressively romanticized and reappropriated by American culture over the centuries. Poems, plays, novels, films, each version fictionalizing a little more, adding layers of invention on top of invention, until arriving in 1995 with a Disney animated film where she talks to the wind and has a relationship of equals with an adult man who, in real life, never demonstrated any romantic interest in her in any document from that era. Anne of Cleves survived the king. Amonute did not survive the empire. To contextualize how much the European narrative of the time protected its own women versus indigenous women, when King Henry VIII of England decided he didn't like Anne of Cleves after their marriage in 1540, he paid her a generous pension, gave her land, let her live comfortably in England for the rest of her life. A European woman unwanted by power still had protection. Amonute was kidnapped at 17, baptized against her will, married to a man 30 years her senior within a context of captivity, taken to another continent as colonial propaganda, and died at 21 years old, far from home, far from her father, far from her language. Her son was raised by strangers. Her people lost the territories she involuntarily helped to legitimize. The distance between the two stories is not one of eras or cultures. It is one of whom the colonial system considered worthy of protection, and whom it considered a disposable tool. That distinction operated with surgical precision for 300 years after her death. Squanto was not a willing helper. The American Thanksgiving narrative has a supporting character that textbooks describe as a friendly Indian who providentially appeared to teach the Pilgrims to plant corn. That character is Tisquantum, known as Squanto, a member of the Patuxent people. What the books don't mention, in 1614, English explorer Thomas Hunt kidnapped 27 members of the Wampanoag and Nauset peoples, including Tisquantum, and sold them as slaves in Malaga, Spain for 20 pounds each. Tisquantum was purchased by Spanish friars, converted to Catholicism, eventually managed to reach London, worked for a merchant named John Slaney, crossed the Atlantic back to North America in 1618, and arrived at his native village only to find that an epidemic had wiped out virtually the entire Patuxent people. Family, friends, everyone dead. When he encountered the Mayflower Pilgrims in 1621, Tisquantum was the only fluent English-speaking survivor available in the region. He didn't show up to help. He showed up because he had nothing left. American Thanksgiving was built on the trauma of a man who had lost everything. The epidemic that cleared the path for the Mayflower. Between 1616 and 1619, an epidemic devastated indigenous populations across New England with a violence that English settlers themselves documented with bewilderment. Estimates from historians and epidemiologists suggest that between 90 and 95% of the coastal indigenous population of what is now Massachusetts and Rhode Island died within less than 3 years. Villages were empty. Already cultivated fields were abandoned. Already built food stores were ownerless. When the Mayflower arrived in November of 1620, the Pilgrims landed on territory that appeared uninhabited. They interpreted this as a divine sign that God had prepared the land for them. God's providence had a more precise name, leptospirosis, smallpox, or typhoid fever, possibly introduced by European fishermen and explorers who had frequented the coast decades earlier. The region the Pilgrims called Plymouth already had a name. It was called Patuxent. Its original inhabitants had died less than 2 years earlier. The Pilgrims, literally, occupied graveyards. The woman who fooled 2 armies. In 1894, a woman named Lozen died of tuberculosis in a prisoner camp in Alabama. American newspapers didn't cover it. The U.S. Army preferred that not many people knew too much about her. Lozen was the sister of Chief Victorio of the Chihenne-Chiricahua Apache people. From adolescence, she fought alongside her brother in campaigns that kept the American Southwest in a state of war against American occupation for more than a decade. She was a tracker, a warrior, and a strategist. General George Crook, who spent years trying to capture her, wrote in his own records that she was as brave as any man, and that her ambush planning skills were exceptional. When Victoria was killed in 1880, she continued with Geronimo. She participated in the final Chiricahua campaign that kept the U.S. Army with more than 5,000 soldiers busy chasing fewer than 40 warriors for 2 years. When Geronimo surrendered in 1886, Lozen was there. She never surrendered on her own terms. She was captured. There was a single protocol for treating prisoners of war. None of it was applied to her. She died imprisoned. The Medicine Lodge Treaty and the 3-day deadline. In October of 1867, the U.S. government signed the Medicine Lodge Treaty with the Comanche, Kiowa, Apache, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations. The treaty guaranteed specific reservations, protection of hunting territories, and government supply deliveries. It was the result of months of negotiation and signed with all formal rituals. It lasted less than a year before being violated. The U.S. government did not deliver the promised supplies. The agents supposed to oversee the reservations skimmed the resources. The railroads continued advancing over the guaranteed territories. In 1868, General Philip Sheridan launched the winter campaign against the signatory nations, claiming they had broken the treaty. When journalists asked Sheridan how he justified attacking peoples who had signed a peace agreement, he replied with a phrase that entered American history: "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." The phrase was uttered in January of 1869. Sheridan denied saying it. 3 witnesses confirmed. The U.S. government investigated nothing. Francis Pegahmagabow, the most lethal sniper of the First World War. Francis Pegahmagabow returned from World War I with 378 confirmed kills and more than 300 prisoners captured, making him the most deadly sniper in the Canadian forces and one of the most lethal in the entire war. He earned the Military Medal with 2 bars, the highest honor a non-commissioned soldier could receive in the British Army of that era. He belonged to the Ojibwe people of Perry Island First Nation in Ontario. When he returned to Canada in 1918, the Canadian government applied to him the same regulations that restricted the freedom of any other Indigenous person. He could not vote, could not legally purchase alcohol, and his activities on reserves were supervised by government agents. A man with 378 confirmed kills in service of Canada had no right to vote in the country he had defended. Pegahmagabow dedicated the rest of his life to Indigenous politics, becoming chief of his community and an activist for First Nations rights. He died in 1952. Canada took decades to include his name in national war memorials, the Battle of Little Bighorn, and what the newspapers didn't say. On June 25, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led 210 men of the 7th Cavalry Regiment to attack a Lakota and Cheyenne camp on the banks of the Little Bighorn River in Montana. The problem with Custer's plan was arithmetic. The camp had between 1,800 and 2,500 warriors, gathered for the annual buffalo hunt. In less than an hour, Custer and all 210 men under his direct command were dead. American newspapers called it a massacre and barbaric betrayal. No newspaper mentioned that the U.S. Army had arrived without a declaration of war, without provocation, attacking a camp with women and children, violating the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which specifically guaranteed that territory to the Lakota nations. 2 years earlier, Custer had confirmed the discovery of gold in the Black Hills, sacred Lakota territory. The U.S. government failed to buy the territory, so they sent Custer. Custer was bad at math. The Black Hills were taken anyway afterward. Sitting Bull died because he was dancing. In December of 1890, the U.S. government was nervous about the ghost dance, a religious movement spreading across the Plains reservations. The dance was a spiritual ceremony prophesying the return of the buffalo, the resurrection of the dead, and the end of American occupation. It was not preparation for war, it was a prayer. The U.S. government made no distinction. Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa Lakota chief, who had fought at Little Bighorn 14 years earlier, lived on a reservation in North Dakota territory. Despite having surrendered in 1881 and living peacefully, his mere presence was considered destabilizing. On December 15, 1890, 43 Indigenous police officers paid by the U.S. government were sent to arrest Sitting Bull. In the confrontation that followed, he was shot twice. He died that day. He was 59 years old. 12 days later, the U.S. Army killed between 250 and 300 Lakota at Wounded Knee. The majority were women and children. The Army called it a battle. Survivors called it a massacre. 27 American soldiers received the Medal of Honor, the highest American military decoration, awarded for killing 300 unarmed people. The Navajo Code that was never broken. During World War II, the U.S. Army used a secret weapon that Japan never managed to crack despite its best cryptographic efforts, the Navajo language. 420 Navajo men were recruited as radio operators between 1942 and 1945. They transmitted military messages in Navajo, a language with complex tonal and grammatical structure that had no standardized written form and was not taught outside reservations. Japanese Major Hiroshi Ohama, responsible for signals intelligence, declared after the war that they never managed to translate a single message. Meanwhile, the United States that used the Navajos to win the war still practiced forced assimilation policies that prohibited Navajo children from speaking their own language in federal schools. The same language that saved American lives in the Pacific was punished with a ruler when spoken by a child in a reservation school. The Navajos only received official recognition from the U.S. Congress in 2001, 56 years after the end of the war, exemplary punctuality from the American government, Carlisle School, and the phrase that defined the policy. In 1879, Captain Richard Henry Pratt founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania with a mission expressed in his most famous phrase, "Kill the Indian, save the man." The declared objective was to eradicate all cultural identity from indigenous children through forced education. Children were taken from their families, sometimes by force, sometimes with promises they would be well treated. Arriving at Carlisle, they were prohibited from speaking their native languages, using their original names, practicing their religions, or maintaining any visible connection to their cultures. Hair was compulsorily cut, which in many indigenous cultures carried religious and mourning significance. The Carlisle School was the model for more than 300 similar institutions that existed across the United States and Canada. It is estimated that more than 100,000 children passed through similar systems between 1879 and 1978. The Canadian system was only formally ended in 1996, not 1896, 1996. There are people alive today who survived that system, the buffalo and the biological weapon, that was never prosecuted. In 1870, there were between 30 million and 60 million American bison on the Great Plains. By 1889, roughly 1,000 remained. The extermination was not accidental, it was deliberate policy. General Philip Sheridan, the same man who said the only good Indian was a dead one, openly declared before the U.S. Congress that buffalo hunters were more useful for solving the Indian problem than 30 years of military operations. The argument was clear. Destroying the food supply of the Plains peoples was more efficient than fighting them militarily. The U.S. government not only allowed but actively encouraged the extermination. Professional hunters received logistical support. The railroads organized hunting excursions, where passengers shot from the cars without even getting off the trains. A military man named William Comstock, contracted by the Kansas Pacific Railroad, killed 408 bison in 8 hours on a single day in 1867. They called it progress. On a historical scale, it was the deliberate destruction of the food system of multiple nations to force their surrender by starvation. The Nuremberg Tribunal didn't exist yet, the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. In June of 1924, President Calvin Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act, granting American citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States. Newspapers treated it as a generous act. In the context, newspapers didn't mention the United States had existed as a nation since 1776. The 14th Amendment, guaranteeing citizenship to all born on American territory, had been enacted in 1868. It took another 56 years for that guarantee to apply to the peoples who had inhabited that continent for millennia before European arrival. And even after 1924, several states continued blocking Native Americans from voting until 1948, using specific state laws. New Mexico and Arizona were the last to allow Native Americans to vote in state elections. Year, 1948. The same Navajos who transmitted secret messages that helped win World War II in 1945 could not vote in their own state 3 years before that. Sacagawea and the details the dollar coin left out. Sacagawea has been on the American gold dollar coin since the year 2000, guide of the Lewis and Clark expedition, symbol of cooperation and voluntary assistance to American Western exploration. What the dollar omits: Sacagawea was a Shoshone girl who had been kidnapped at around 11 or 12 years old by Hidatsa warriors during a raid. She was later sold or gambled away to a French-Canadian trader named Toussaint Charbonneau, who took her as a wife. She was approximately 15 years old when Lewis and Clark arrived at the Mandan village in 1804. Charbonneau was hired as an interpreter and Sacagawea came along. She gave birth to her first child during the expedition in February of 1805. The labor was difficult, and the expedition's doctor administered rattlesnake powder as medicine, standard practice of the era. She carried the baby throughout the entire expedition of more than 4,000 kilometers. Lewis and Clark paid Charbonneau. Sacagawea received no compensation. The U.S. government paid Charbonneau $522 and 320 acres of land. The market value of an enslaved woman and her geographical knowledge of a continent, zero. The mother of American agriculture. Roughly 60% of the foods the world eats today were domesticated by indigenous peoples of the Americas. Corn, potato, tomato, chocolate, vanilla, pepper, peanut, avocado, sunflower, rubber, quinoa, cassava, sweet potato, tobacco, turkey, and a list that continues for another 3 pages. Europe before 1492 ate a lot of bread, a lot of cabbage, and a lot of pork. No potato, no tomato, no beans. The Ireland that lost a quarter of its population in the Great Famine of 1845 was dying from the lack of a plant that had been domesticated in Peru 6,000 years earlier. Modern medicine uses components derived from plants identified and processed by indigenous peoples millennia ago. Aspirin is based on a compound from willow bark that North American indigenous peoples were already using therapeutically when Europe was still bleeding patients as its primary medical treatment. This knowledge was systematically collected by colonizers, documented in the name of European academies, patented by European and American companies, and the peoples who developed that knowledge over centuries received neither credit nor compensation. The Seminole resistance that never signed the surrender. The Seminole nation of Florida never signed a peace treaty with the United States. This is not a metaphor. This is not modern political exaggeration. It is a documented legal fact. The three Seminole Wars occurred between 1817 and 1858. The U.S. government spent an estimated $40 to $60 million of that era on the campaigns, an amount equivalent to more than $1 billion in modern values, trying to remove the Seminoles from Florida. It never succeeded. At the end of the Third Seminole War in 1858, roughly 100 to 300 Seminoles remained hidden in the Everglades. The U.S. Army declared victory and left. The Seminoles simply stayed. Their descendants live in Florida today as the Seminole Tribe of Florida, federally recognized, and were never technically defeated nor signed any surrender. When the Seminole Tribe of Florida trademarked the branding for their gift shop and casino network, they chose the slogan, "The Unconquered People." That is not marketing. That is accurate. The Cherokee woman who negotiated her people's return. In 1885, Sarah Winnemucca of the Northern Paiute people published a book called Life Among the Paiutes, Their Wrongs and Claims, becoming the first Native American woman to publish an autobiography. But before the publication, she did something more immediate. She went to Washington, D.C. twice, met Secretary of the Interior, Carl Schurz, and obtained a signed order for the Paiutes, who had been forcibly removed to the Malheur Reservation in Oregon, to return to their original lands in Nevada. The order was signed. The U.S. Army refused to implement it. Winnemucca spent the following years giving public lectures in Boston, New York, and other cities, openly criticizing the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the reservation agent system that she described as corrupt and violent. She received threats. She continued. She gave more than 300 lectures. No federal agent she accused was investigated, but she created a public record of denunciations at a time when most Americans had never met a Native American and depended entirely on government versions of what was happening on the reservations. The gold of the Black Hills and the case that lasted a century. The Black Hills, Pahasapa in the Lakota language, were guaranteed to the Sioux Nation by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 as permanent and exclusive territory. In 1874, the Custer Expedition confirmed the existence of gold in the region. In 1876, the Wahunsenacah Congress passed unilateral legislation reducing Sioux territory and opening the Black Hills to mining. No Sioux representative was consulted. In 1920, the Sioux Nation filed a lawsuit contesting the taking of the Black Hills. The case reached the U.S. Supreme Court in 1980. The Supreme Court ruled that the Black Hills had in fact been illegally taken, and that the U.S. government owed reparations to the Sioux Nation. The amount with accrued interest in 2024 exceeds $1,200 million. The Sioux Nation refused to accept the money. They say Pahasapa is not for sale. The money sits in a blocked federal account, growing every year. Mount Rushmore, the monument carved in the Black Hills with the faces of 4 American presidents, sits on territory that the U.S. Supreme Court itself declared was stolen. Geronimo never asked to be a battle cry. Geronimo's real name was Goyawe, the one who yawns in Apache. The name Geronimo was given by Mexican soldiers during battles in Mexico, possibly as a desperate cry invoking St. Jerome. That is the name that stuck. Goyawe was a spiritual leader and Chiricahua Apache warrior who saw his mother, wife, and 3 children massacred by Mexican soldiers in 1851. He spent the following decades resisting American and Mexican occupation of Apache territory in Arizona and New Mexico. He surrendered in 1886 with guarantees that he and his warriors would be treated as prisoners of war and would return to Arizona within 2 years. The U.S. government sent them to camps in Florida and Alabama. They never returned to Arizona. Geronimo died at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1909, still technically a prisoner of war, 23 years after the surrender. He asked multiple times to be allowed to die on his land. He was denied every time. In 2011, when U.S. Special Forces killed Osama bin Laden, the code name for the operation was Geronimo. The U.S. government used the name of an Apache prisoner of war as the code name for killing the biggest enemy of a generation. The Apache family formally protested. Nobody apologized. The man who built 3 cities and was buried as a pauper. Ailey Samuel Parker was born in 1828 on the Tonawanda Seneca Reservation in New York. Son of a Seneca chief, he learned English, Latin, and law, but was barred from practicing as a lawyer in New York because the law of the time required American citizenship, and Native Americans were not considered citizens. He became an engineer, worked with Ulysses Grant on warehouse construction in Galena, Illinois, and when the American Civil War began, offered his services to the Army. He was rejected 3 times because the Army did not accept non-citizens. The 4th attempt was accepted. He rose to the rank of brigadier general. When Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox in April of 1865, Parker, as Grant's military secretary, wrote the final terms of surrender in his own hand. The document that ended the American Civil War was written by a man the U.S. government did not recognize as a citizen. Grant later appointed him Commissioner of Indian Affairs, the first Native American to hold that position. He was removed after corruption charges that a congressional investigation later found to be groundless. He died in 1895 in financial difficulty. New York finally placed a plaque in his honor in 1974, the Sand Creek Massacre and the general who received applause. On November 29, 1864, Colonel John Chivington led 700 Colorado soldiers in an attack on the Cheyenne and Arapaho camp at Sand Creek. The camp was under formal U.S. government protection. Chief Black Kettle had received assurances from the general at Fort Lyon that the camp was safe. An American flag was flying at the center of the camp. Chivington attacked at dawn. Estimates suggest between 150 and 200 people were killed. The majority women, children, and elderly, as most men of fighting age were out hunting. What Chivington's troops did with the bodies cannot be described in detail on a YouTube compliance-focused channel. Chivington's troops returned to Denver with human trophies they displayed publicly at the local theater to audience applause. A U.S. congressional investigation in 1865 concluded that the attack was a massacre and that Chivington had violated his own conditional surrender. No formal charges were filed. Chivington was never tried. He died in 1894 of cancer at peace. The reservation as American invention. The American reservation system was formalized by the Indian Appropriations Act of 1851, which, for the first time, legally defined specific lands where indigenous peoples would be confined. The premise was that this would solve the Indian problem through containment. What the act did not define was any permanent protection. In 1887, the Dawes Act divided reservations into individual plots, distributed plots to indigenous families, and sold the remainder to white settlers. Between 1887 and 1934, American indigenous peoples lost 90 million acres of reservation land, roughly 2/3 of what they had in 1887. The official argument was that individual property ownership would civilize the natives. The documented result was widespread impoverishment, as many families quickly sold or lost their plots for lack of capital to develop them. The reservation system that exists today is the result of 170 years of adjustments, removals, partial restorations, and negotiations. There are approximately 507 federally recognized reservations in the United States. The smallest has less than 1 acre. The largest, the Navajo Reservation in Arizona, is larger than 10 American states. The last language nobody speaks anymore. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, there were between 500 and 700 distinct indigenous languages being spoken just in the territory that is now the United States and Canada. Each language was a complete knowledge system, not just vocabulary, but ways of organizing time, space, relationships, and the natural world. Some languages had no concept of individual property. Others organized events in cycles rather than chronological lines. In 2023, the American Linguistic Census estimated that fewer than 150 of these languages still had native speakers, and most had fewer than 100, almost all elderly. The Eyak language of Alaska had its last native speaker, Marie Smith Jones, die in 2008. The Catawba language of South Carolina had its last native speaker die in 1996. Each death is an extinction. This is not an ecological metaphor. It is the extinction of a complete system of understanding the world, accumulated over millennia, that disappears when the last person who carries it closes their eyes. The English that replaced these languages was introduced by methods that included hitting children for speaking the wrong language. That was not centuries ago. It was within the lifetime of people still living. The Eagle Act and the paradox of the present. The bald eagle is the national symbol of the United States. It appears on the Great Seal, on coins, on official documents, on military uniforms. It is the emblem of the American nation. Under the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act of 1940, any American citizen who possesses bald eagle feathers can be fined up to $10,000 and imprisoned for up to 2 years. There is exactly one exception. Certified members of federally recognized Native American tribes may possess eagle feathers for ceremonial purposes. The same nation that prohibited indigenous dances, indigenous languages, indigenous religious ceremonies, and confiscated sacred objects for more than 100 years decided that its own symbol can only be legally used for religious purposes by the same peoples who were prohibited from practicing religion for a century. The U.S. government is the only entity authorized to collect feathers from dead eagles and distribute them to tribes through the National Eagle Repository. There is a waiting list. In 2024, the wait was approximately 2 to 3 years to receive feathers from a bird that their ancestors found everywhere, and that was central to their spiritual practices long before there was a nation called the United States. The face that wasn't on Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore was carved between 1927 and 1941. The four faces are Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln. It sits in the Black Hills, in the mountains that the U.S. Supreme Court declared to be Lakota territory that was illegally taken. The sculptor, Gutzon Borglum, was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. The mountain itself had a Lakota name before, Tlunkashila Shakpe, the Six Grandfathers. 6 kilometers away, since 1948, Korczak Ziolkowski and later his sons and grandchildren have been working on the Crazy Horse Memorial, a sculpture of Lakota Chief Tashunkawitko, Crazy Horse, on a different mountain in the Black Hills. The sculpture has not been completed. Crazy Horse's face was finished in 1998. The outstretched arm, which will point toward his people's lands, is still being carved. Now, when someone asked Crazy Horse in his lifetime, "Where are your lands?" he replied with an outstretched arm, "My lands are where my dead are buried." He was killed by bayonet while in military custody in 1877. He was roughly 36 years old. The 10-year-old girl, and the myth that still sells. Disney released Pocahontas in 1995 and won 2 Oscars. The film cost $55 million to produce and grossed more than $346 million worldwide. Mattel released the Pocahontas doll. There was Pocahontas at McDonald's. There was Pocahontas in Halloween costumes. The name of a woman who died imprisoned, far from home at 21 years old, unable to see her son grow up, unable to return to her father, without ever having chosen anything that happened to her, was turned into a mass consumer product that generated more money in a single year than any compensation the U.S. government has ever paid to the indigenous nations of the Chesapeake region. Her son, Thomas Rolfe, grew up in England, returned to Virginia in 1640, and fought in colonial wars against the Powhatan, his mother's people. This is not tragic in the abstract. It is concrete. The son of Amonute fought against Amonute's relatives in defense of the men who had kidnapped Amonute. Colonial history has that level of rawness sometimes. No dramatization needed. The facts are enough.